In the winter of 1903, when the ground lay stiff with frost and the past seemed safely buried beneath it, two young women were brought into the county infirmary under heavy escort. They looked no older than 16, though no one could say for certain. Their faces were identical down to the faint scar above the left eyebrow, their movements synchronized with an instinctive precision that unsettled even the most hardened attendants. They did not cry, nor did they resist. They simply watched, eyes wide and hollow, as though the world had already ended somewhere far behind them. The sisters were found in a rotting farmhouse at the edge of the marshlands, a place locals avoided long before anyone could explain why. Inside, the air was thick with decay and silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the low hum of insects feeding on what had been left behind. There were no photographs on the walls, no mirrors, no evidence of a woman's presence, only locked doors, nailed windows, and a single table scarred by years of use. In the cellar, investigators discovered markings etched into the stone, lines repeating in pairs, over and over, as if someone had been counting something they feared to forget. Doctors quickly realized the twins shared more than appearance. Their bodies bore signs of repeated genetic collapse, frail bones, malformed joints, and nervous systems that reacted unpredictably to touch. When questioned separately, they fell silent. When questioned together, they whispered answers that overlapped, finishing each other's thoughts without ever making eye contact with the men asking the questions. It was as if language itself had been learned in captivity. The name they eventually gave belonged to a man long known in the county, a landowner who attended church, paid his taxes, and buried his dead without ceremony. When asked about their mother, the twins smiled for the first time. Then, in the same breath, they said they had never known such a word, only one rule: everything in the house belonged to their father, including them. The discovery of the twin sisters in 1903 did not happen through an organized investigation or a missing persons report, but through accident and neglect finally colliding. A winter storm had forced a railway crew to reroute through the marshlands, an area long considered uninhabitable due to flooding and disease. While inspecting a collapsed drainage embankment near the tracks, one of the workers noticed smoke rising thinly from behind a cluster of dead trees. At first it seemed impossible, as no registered homes were meant to exist within miles of that land. Curiosity overcame caution, and the men followed the smoke until they found a farmhouse sagging under its own weight, half swallowed by mud and reeds, its windows boarded and its roof patched with scrap wood and rusted tin. When they knocked, there was no answer, yet the door was not locked. Inside, the house was eerily clean in places and violently decayed in others, as if time itself had been selectively ignored. Footprints in the dust suggested movement, but no adults appeared. Only after calling out repeatedly did they notice two figures standing at the far end of the main room, nearly blending into the shadows. The girls were barefoot despite the cold, dressed in identical, outdated clothing that hung loosely from their frames. They did not approach, nor did they flee. They stood together so closely their shoulders touched, breathing in the same rhythm. What struck the men most was the way the sisters looked at them, not with fear, but with an unsettling familiarity, as though strangers entering their world had been expected all along. Their speech was slow and cautious, words chosen carefully, as if each sentence carried risk. They could not state their ages, only that they had always been there, in that house, with the same man. When asked if anyone else lived with them, they shook their heads in unison. Local authorities were summoned, and even then, the process of removing the twins took hours. They refused to leave without each other and reacted violently when separated, screaming in a raw, animal panic that echoed across the marsh. Neighbors, drawn by the noise, gathered at a distance, many claiming they had always known something was wrong with that land, that no crops grew there and no animals lingered, and that sometimes at night, long before this day, voices could be heard drifting across the water, always two, never one. The medical examination of the twin sisters began as a routine intake assessment, but within minutes it became clear that nothing about their condition was ordinary. Physicians noted immediately that their physical development was uneven and fragile, their bodies shaped by forces that had worked against them since birth. Their height was far below average for their estimated age, their limbs thin and slightly asymmetrical, and their posture strained as though their skeletons had never fully learned how to carry weight. Even simple movements caused visible discomfort, yet neither sister complained, reacting instead with a distant calm that unsettled the staff more than any cry might have. Closer inspection revealed abnormalities that seasoned doctors had only encountered in textbooks or whispered case studies. Their facial structures showed mirrored deformities, subtle but unmistakable, suggesting repeated genetic narrowing rather than a single anomaly. Hearing tests showed partial loss in both sisters, while vision assessments revealed identical blind spots, as though their eyes had developed from the same flawed blueprint. When blood samples were taken, the results confirmed what many feared but hesitated to voice. The twins shared an alarming concentration of inherited defects that could only result from close familial breeding repeated over time. What disturbed the physicians most was not just the extent of the damage, but its consistency. The twins' conditions aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. It suggested a controlled environment where isolation was not accidental but enforced, where the same bloodlines had been folded back into themselves without interruption. Notes from the examination describe the doctors lowering their voices, aware that the sisters watched their faces closely, sensing shifts in tone even when words were withheld. Psychological evaluations deepened the unease. The twins displayed an extreme emotional dependence on one another, responding to stress as a single unit. When one showed anxiety, the other mirrored it within seconds, their pulses rising together, their breathing falling into the same shallow rhythm. Doctors suspected that this bond was not simply natural twin closeness, but a survival mechanism shaped by long-term confinement and shared trauma. The final reports used restrained language, but between the lines was a clear recognition that what had been done to these girls was deliberate, prolonged, and hidden in plain sight for years beyond counting. From the moment authorities attempted to separate the twins for questioning, it became evident that their bond went far beyond emotional attachment. When led into different rooms, even briefly, both sisters reacted with immediate distress, their bodies tensing as if struck by the same unseen force. Within seconds, their calm dissolved into panic. They clawed at doors, screamed until their voices fractured, and collapsed to the floor in violent spasms that alarmed the staff. The reaction was so severe that doctors quickly intervened, fearing cardiac shock or neurological damage. From that moment on, no effort was made to keep them apart for more than a few breaths. When questioned together, their behavior shifted. They sat shoulder to shoulder, fingers intertwined, eyes fixed on a point just above the interviewer's head. Their speech emerged in fragments, broken phrases passed back and forth as if the words themselves belonged to both of them. One would begin a sentence, the other would finish it. Sometimes they spoke simultaneously, repeating the same line in perfect unison. Other times, they corrected each other with subtle head movements or a tightening of the hand, silently negotiating what could be said and what must remain buried. The content of their answers only deepened the unease. They did not use names as most people did, referring instead to roles and rules. The man who raised them was not described with emotion but with function, as though he were part of the house itself. Time, for the twins, did not move forward in years or seasons but in repeated routines, marked by sounds, footsteps, and locked doors. Their memories seemed arranged in patterns rather than sequences, making it difficult for officials to establish a clear timeline of events. Doctors observing the interviews noted that the sisters rarely blinked while speaking, their expressions flat yet intensely focused. When a question pushed too close to forbidden territory, both would fall silent at once, breathing shallowly until the moment passed. Attempts to coax individual responses failed entirely. When asked directly to speak alone, the twins stared at each other in visible confusion, as if the concept itself was incomprehensible. What emerged from these sessions was not a clear confession or narrative, but a disturbing insight into a shared consciousness shaped by fear and dependency. The twins did not experience themselves as separate individuals with private thoughts. They were two bodies housing a single, fractured survival instinct, forged in isolation, reinforced by punishment, and bound together so tightly that separation felt less like distance and more like extinction. As officials struggled to piece together the twins' origins, attention turned to county records, where the paper trail should have offered clarity but instead revealed deliberate distortion. Birth registries from the late 19th century showed 2 entries made on the same day, written in the same hand, listing twin girls born on a rural property near the marshlands. The space reserved for the mother's name was left blank, an irregularity that should have triggered inquiry but somehow passed without comment. In the margins, a small note referenced a home birth attended privately, signed by a man already familiar to the clerks, one whose name appeared repeatedly across decades of land deeds, tax filings, and burial permits. Further examination exposed a pattern too precise to be accidental. Earlier records revealed similar entries spaced roughly 20 years apart, each documenting children born on the same property, each lacking maternal identification, and each certified by that same man as witness and guardian. Some of those children had no death records at all, while others were marked as deceased within weeks of birth, though no graves could be located in parish logs. The repetition suggested not bureaucratic laziness but intention, a quiet manipulation of a system that trusted familiar names and rarely questioned rural households beyond their taxes. Church baptism books deepened the concern. Several entries showed names crossed out or overwritten, dates altered, and remarks added years later in darker ink. One priest's marginal note questioned the absence of a mother but ended abruptly, followed by several missing pages torn cleanly from the book. When questioned, the aging clergyman claimed no memory of the family beyond routine blessings and funerals, though his handwriting matched the annotations precisely. What troubled investigators most was how easily the omissions had been accepted. In an era obsessed with lineage and inheritance, the total erasure of maternal identity should have raised alarms. Instead, the records treated the father's authority as sufficient proof of legitimacy. The man had leveraged respectability and consistency, presenting himself as a solitary caretaker burdened by misfortune, a narrative no one bothered to challenge. As files were stacked and compared, it became clear that the twins were not anomalies but products of a long, hidden system of record manipulation. The absence of a mother was not an oversight but a deliberate void, maintained year after year, allowing generations to be born, confined, and erased without ever officially existing beyond the father's signature. As scrutiny intensified, the figure of the father emerged from the records not as a recluse but as a man woven tightly into the fabric of the county. He had owned the marshland property for more than 40 years, acquiring it cheaply after a series of unexplained foreclosures drove neighboring families away. Tax documents showed consistent payments, sometimes in advance, suggesting careful attention to maintaining his standing with local officials. He attended town meetings just often enough to be remembered, spoke little, and never invited questions. To most, he was unremarkable, which in hindsight became his greatest shield. Interviews with long-term residents revealed a pattern of controlled visibility. The man was seen regularly in public spaces, but always alone. He purchased supplies in precise quantities, never more than needed, never too little. Clerks recalled that he avoided casual conversation, yet responded politely when spoken to, projecting the image of a disciplined widower or lifelong bachelor. When asked about family, he deflected with humor or vague references to poor health and the burdens of rural life. No one remembered seeing women or children accompany him, but few found that odd given the isolation of the property. What began to surface, however, were inconsistencies in memory that suggested quiet normalization of the abnormal. Several neighbors admitted that they had occasionally heard children's voices drifting from the marsh at night, thin and distant, but assumed the sounds carried from other settlements across the water. Others recalled glimpses of movement behind the farmhouse windows, shapes that vanished when approached. One farmer remembered seeing two identical girls standing in the field years earlier, but convinced himself it was a trick of light, an illusion created by exhaustion and fog. The father's authority over his land was absolute. He allowed no visitors beyond officials and tradesmen, and even then, interactions were confined to the doorway or yard. Fences were reinforced not to keep animals in, but to keep sightlines out. Those who questioned his isolation were met with mild irritation, never anger, as though he understood that composure was his strongest defense. By the time investigators connected these fragments, the realization was unavoidable. The man had not merely lived unnoticed, he had cultivated invisibility while remaining officially present. Through routine, respectability, and the quiet weight of male authority, he had created a private dominion where no scrutiny penetrated and where control could be exercised for decades without interruption. As word of the investigation spread, long-buried memories began to surface among the townspeople, drawn out by the sudden attention to the marshland property. Neighbors who had once dismissed their unease now spoke with hesitation, as though afraid their recollections might summon something back into being. Several residents recalled nights when sleep was broken by sounds drifting across the water, carried by the wind in a way that made distance impossible to judge. The voices were high and rhythmic, neither laughter nor crying, but something in between, repeating phrases over and over until they dissolved into the hum of insects and frogs. One woman, whose family had lived near the edge of the marsh for generations, described standing on her porch as a young girl and hearing what she thought were prayers being spoken in unison. The words were indistinct, yet the cadence was unmistakably synchronized, as if two mouths were following the same script. Her mother had pulled her inside and barred the door, warning her never to listen too closely to sounds that did not belong to the living. At the time, the story was treated as superstition, folded into local folklore and left unexamined. Others spoke of lights flickering inside the farmhouse long after midnight, moving from room to room with deliberate slowness. A delivery driver recalled approaching the house once and hearing footsteps circling the structure from within, always keeping pace with his own. When he knocked, the movement stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt unnatural. He left the supplies at the gate and never returned. These accounts shared a common thread of ritual, repetition, and restraint. No one remembered screams or overt violence, only controlled patterns that suggested order imposed from above. The idea that children might be involved was too disturbing for most to articulate, so the memories were softened, reinterpreted, or forgotten entirely. Over time, the marsh itself became a convenient explanation, blamed for strange acoustics and hallucinations caused by fog and isolation. As investigators recorded these testimonies, a clearer image emerged of a household governed by routine and fear, where voices were trained to rise and fall together, and where deviation carried consequences. The community's long silence was not born of ignorance but of avoidance, a collective agreement to let the unsettling remain unexplained. In retrospect, the sounds heard in the night were not ghosts or echoes, but living proof of a hidden life repeating itself endlessly just beyond the reach of light. The physical search of the property began under the pretense of routine inspection, but it quickly turned into something far more unsettling. Behind the farmhouse, concealed by collapsing sheds and overgrown reeds, investigators uncovered a series of locked outbuildings whose existence did not appear on any land survey. Each structure showed signs of long-term use, yet none were designed for ordinary labor or storage. Inside, the walls were marked with shallow scratches and repetitive carvings made at a child's height, patterns that matched those found earlier in the cellar. The marks were not random. They followed sequences, as though someone had been counting days, steps, or punishments. Beneath the main house, a narrow passage led to rooms deliberately hidden from the original foundation plans. These spaces were windowless and reinforced, their doors fitted with heavy bolts on the outside. The air inside was stale and thick, suggesting years of confinement. Straw bedding lay arranged in pairs, always two places side by side, worn down to the floorboards. No personal belongings were found beyond crude wooden toys fashioned identically, reinforcing the sense that individuality had never been permitted. Documents discovered in a locked trunk added a deeper layer of horror. Handwritten logs detailed schedules rather than names, recording feedings, instruction periods, and punishments using symbols instead of words. Dates spanned decades. Some entries were crossed out abruptly, replaced by new symbols that investigators later realized corresponded to births and disappearances. There were no mentions of deaths, only absences where routines ended without explanation. The most disturbing discovery came from a sealed room at the rear of the property. Inside were remnants of children's clothing spanning multiple generations, preserved and repaired long past usefulness. The sizes ranged from infant to adolescent, yet the style never changed, suggesting cycles rather than progress. A crude family tree had been scratched into the wall, looping back on itself repeatedly, with no branches extending outward. Taken together, the evidence revealed a system of generational confinement carefully maintained beyond a single lifetime. This was not neglect or desperation but a controlled environment designed to isolate, reproduce, and erase without leaving conventional traces. The house itself functioned as a closed world, where children were born, conditioned, and replaced, and where the twins found in 1903 were only the most recent survivors of a lineage that had never been meant to reach beyond those walls. After weeks of silence and fractured interviews, the twins finally agreed to speak in full, but only under conditions that unsettled everyone present. They would not be questioned individually, and they would not answer interruptions. The room had to be small, the doors closed, and no men allowed to stand behind them. Most disturbingly, they insisted that their confession be heard as a single voice, not two accounts to be compared or separated. Officials reluctantly agreed, sensing that whatever truth lay beneath their restraint would never surface otherwise. When the session began, the sisters sat facing each other rather than the investigators, knees touching, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles blanched. They spoke softly at first, alternating words in a measured rhythm, building sentences together like something rehearsed long ago. As their confidence grew, their voices began to overlap, merging into a steady cadence that filled the room and made the listeners feel like intruders in a private ritual. They did not recount events chronologically. Instead, they described rules, lessons, and consequences, repeating phrases as though repetition itself was necessary to survive the telling. They explained that speaking alone had always been forbidden, that silence was safety and unity was obedience. When one was punished, both were punished. When one was fed, both were fed. The father, they said, taught them that separation was a lie invented by outsiders, that they were not two daughters but a matched set, made to fulfill a purpose that could not be divided. They described nights spent reciting words until exhaustion blurred their thoughts, days measured by footsteps approaching and retreating, and the constant awareness that their bodies were watched, evaluated, and corrected. As the confession continued, the atmosphere in the room shifted from discomfort to dread. Officials struggled to take notes, their hands shaking as the implications became clearer. The twins spoke without anger or hysteria, recounting their experiences with the calm detachment of those who had never known an alternative. When asked why they were finally speaking now, both turned their gaze outward for the first time. In unison, they said that the rules no longer applied because the house was empty, and the voice that had enforced them was finally silent. The moment the twins began to reveal the truth about their father, the room grew heavy with tension, as though the air itself recoiled from the words. Their voices, still merged into one, described a figure who had not simply raised them but had orchestrated every aspect of their existence with precision and cruelty. He was not merely a guardian or disciplinarian, he was an omnipresent authority, a silent shadow in every corner of the house, shaping their thoughts, fears, and even the way they perceived each other. They spoke of rules that went beyond punishment, rules that dictated whom they could speak to, what they could touch, and how they were allowed to think. The father had created a system of obedience so complete that deviation was unthinkable, and yet, within the walls, it was the only reality they knew. The twins described acts that blurred the line between parental control and calculated manipulation. There were instructions on how to walk, how to stand, and how to respond to each other in exact harmony. They were compelled to mirror each other in every gesture, every tone, every glance, so that no hint of individuality could survive. They spoke of nights where the father would enter their rooms silently, inspecting their bodies, correcting perceived flaws, and enforcing an intimacy between them that the world outside would never understand. The sisters' recollections suggested a pattern repeated over decades, generations perhaps, where his authority extended beyond normal bounds of care, into an arena of possession and secrecy. Officials felt the chill of their words not just because of what was described but because of how it was described. The twins' tone carried no accusation, no bitterness, only matter-of-fact acknowledgement that this had been their reality. They articulated the fear and reverence intertwined in their upbringing, revealing a man whose control was total, yet executed with a terrifying subtlety. There were no visible scars, no outward signs of violence, yet every detail of their behavior, speech, and even thought had been sculpted to fit his exacting standards. What emerged from their confession was not simply horror at what one man had done, but an understanding that his influence was generational, structural, and psychological. The father's role was not just the exercise of brute authority, but the creation of a world within a world, a closed, self-sustaining universe where he dictated life and death, learning and obedience, isolation and connection. Through these revelations, investigators began to grasp the magnitude of control he had maintained, a dominion so complete that even the twins' very identities had been shaped to serve it. When the full scope of the twins' confession became clear, the authorities realized the truth was something the public could scarcely comprehend. The father's actions had not been a series of isolated incidents, but a meticulously maintained system that had persisted for decades, hidden in plain sight under the guise of normalcy. The realization struck every official in the room with a weight that seemed almost physical. The girls were only the latest in a chain of generations subjected to confinement, control, and systematic erasure. Their lives were not merely tragic, they were the culmination of a structure designed to survive scrutiny and manipulate perception, a private world entirely dictated by one man's will. Faced with this knowledge, those in charge began to consider the consequences of revealing it. The details were so extreme, so fundamentally disturbing, that the idea of public exposure seemed unthinkable. The community itself had been unknowingly complicit through silence and oversight, and to bring the full truth into the open could ignite hysteria or moral panic. Officials debated the language of reports, carefully choosing words that could convey the severity of the case without spelling out the full scope of abuse. Sensitive documents were locked away, and certain lines of inquiry were deliberately redacted, leaving gaps in the public record that could never fully explain the horror that had unfolded within the farmhouse. Even among investigators, there was an unspoken recognition that the human mind might struggle to process what had been done. The father's dominion had extended far beyond physical control. It had reshaped thought, loyalty, and identity. To expose the truth in all its detail risked unraveling the sense of normalcy for those who heard it. The twins themselves had lived for years under rules so absolute that the concept of freedom was almost alien. Their confession revealed not only the father's power but also the fragility of the human psyche when subjected to prolonged, deliberate manipulation. In the weeks following the confession, authorities took painstaking measures to secure the twins' future. They were placed under careful care, shielded from public curiosity, and relocated to a controlled environment where their development could be monitored. All physical evidence of their confinement, from the carvings in the walls to the furniture in the hidden rooms, was documented but removed or sealed to prevent morbid fascination. The father, by then long deceased, remained a ghost in the records, a man whose actions had shaped multiple lives and whose legacy of control could only be glimpsed through the haunting testimony of the sisters. Ultimately, the case was archived with layers of restriction, a decision born not of denial but of necessity. The truth was preserved, yet simultaneously hidden, acknowledged only in fragments by those who had witnessed it firsthand, a grim reminder that some horrors are too vast, too systematic, and too psychologically invasive to ever be fully digested by the world outside the walls where they were born and maintained.